This is Maui Community College, with a world of knowledge here at home.
So the simplest form of a chest tube is a needle with an angiocath on it. The trauma web page recommends one that's 4 inches long. Anything that will get in there will work just fine. So needle decompression is the emergency treatment for attention pneumothorax. A large bore needle of 14 or 16 gauge with a catheter can be used to decompress the pleural space, and that will cause the tension pneumothorax, that cause that air to have a place to be released, and then we just end up with a simple pneumothorax, and that gives us some time. So for an emergency treatment of tension pneumothorax, a large bore 14, 16 gauge needle with a catheter is inserted into the second intercostal space just above the third rib at the midclavicular line. The blood supply that runs with the ribs runs underneath the rib. And so when you do any kind of needle procedure that might come in contact with the rib, we want to keep the needle above the rib. That's where the blood supply is not. The blood supply is beneath the rib. So an emergency treatment of tension pneumothorax is a large bore 16, 18 gauge needle with the catheter inserted into the second intercostal space just above the third rib at the midclavicular line. I think a picture is helpful. And so if this person having tension pneumothorax, the easiest and quickest way to apply a life-saving treatment is to insert a needle right there, second intercostal space of the midclavicular line. And so once the needle catheter has been inserted in the pleural space, air will rush out. If you ever see this happen, you'll hear the air blow out of the needle. And so once that air is rushed out, the chest has been decompressed, and now this gives us time to insert a chest tube. And a chest tube is usually inserted by a physician at the bedside. The entry point for a chest tube is the fourth or fifth intercostal space on the mid-axillary line. The mid-axillary line runs under your axilla, your armpit. So here's a picture of their armpit. The surgeon is drawing his entry point for a chest tube. And when people have chest tubes, you'll see them placed in this area. This is a sterile procedure. So once they're prepped and draped, the procedure begins. Your chest wall has lots of nerves, and you don't tolerate chest pain very well. I assure you, these procedures are very painful. Pain control is essential to the successful performance of a chest tube insertion. I've drawn here, now the chest tube's on the opposite side. I've drawn here a little marker showing you where the chest tube is. Hopefully you can see that on X-ray. Someone's had a chest tube inserted to re-inflate the lungs. After the chest tube is inserted, they're usually sutured into place to be secured so they don't come out easily. And then we usually use Vaseline gauze around the opening of the chest tube to seal the opening, prevent air leaks. That's important. And cover them up with Vaseline gauze and dress them, and you'll see all sorts of different ways to secure the chest tube. The earliest chest tubes were connected to nothing more than what's known as a Heimlich valve. So we've inserted the chest tube, and now here's the open end of the chest tube. And what do we do with it? Well, there are lots and lots and lots of variations on how to drain and control a chest tube, and we're going to try to talk about as many as I can. But the simplest thing to put on the end of a chest tube is quite simply a one-way valve, a Heimlich valve. The original Heimlich valves is just like cutting off the finger of a glove and putting a little hole in it, and you can blow out of that glove, but air will not come back in. This is a more complex, sealed and sterile version of that simple glove valve. It's called a Heimlich valve. You'll also hear it called a check valve, one-way valve. If you see this abbreviation somewhere on these PowerPoints, that means one-way valve. These check valves, Heimlich valves, one-way valves, they're going to allow air or fluid to only go in one direction. These valves are not going to allow air or fluid to enter the chest tube. And so this is the simplest thing that we can put on the end of a chest tube, but that's not usually what you're going to see in a hospital. Most likely you will find a very complex collection system connected to the chest tube, and maybe the system that you use looks like this, or maybe the system you use looks like this. No matter what, no matter how complex, they are all based on a 3-bottle system. And so here's my cartoon of the 3-bottle chest tube collection system. And I've now numbered the bottles 1, 2, and 3. That won't necessarily be how they are numbered on other systems, but this is how I number them. And so number 1 is the collection bottle, and we can see fluid from the chest tube dripping into the collection bottle. The second bottle is what's called the water seal, and this has all sorts of functions that we'll talk about. And then if we apply the system to suction, we'll need some kind of suction control. And so the third bottle, the suction control, is there to make sure that a consistent and precise amount of suction is applied to the chest tube system. So the first bottle in a chest tube collection system is the collection bottle. And fluid from the chest tube is going to drain into the first bottle. And we can measure the amount of fluid. It's graduated, so we can measure the amount of fluid in a collection bottle or a collection chamber. It's also important to note its color. Normal pleural fluid is usually serous, and so when it's yellow in appearance, that means serous, as in serum. Sanguineous means blood, and so when it's red, we call that sanguineous. And then sometimes it's a mixture of blood and serum, and we call that serosanguinous.